So does you being indoors mean that Minnesota's finally bottomed out with cold temps, or what? You just decided to mix it up today?
Yeah, we are. There's a lot of snow. So we've gotten a lot of snow the last week.
Really?
Yeah, about to get more tomorrow. Guess there'll be flurries today, but we're supposed to get another storm tomorrow. So,
Hey, it's like 50 down here in Alabama right now. So I noticed it yesterday. I drove after church, and like it's funny. Like as you know, you get out the first time, you get gas. Like, oh, still cold. Put on the jacket. Next place, it's okay. And then like the last place I stopped, it was like probably could have been in a t-shirt and been no big deal.
yeah.
Yeah. Looks like we got everybody.
Yeah, we're good.
We got a good group.
Good to see everybody.
So we're gonna be continuing on. We just got done, I guess, a full week ago, looking at Matthew chapter 10, where Jesus commissions his 12 apostles and sends them out in the area in Judea for the what's called the limited commission sometimes. And a big feature of Matthew chapter 10, I mean, he had some instructions of, hey, do this, don't do this, carry this, don't carry that, say this, etc. But honestly, the bulk of the chapter is about how to deal with rejection, how to deal with people not appreciating you, not liking you, not wanting your message. And we're going to actually just continue into Matthew chapter 11 today because Jesus gives some more teachings. It's interesting to me that Matthew chapters 11 and 12 really, at least it seems to me, most of the stories there are Jesus further exploring that rejection or at least confusion that people have toward him and toward those who are going to preach the gospel. So it's pretty helpful, actually. Jesus tells them, here's how you deal with the rejection. Here's how you think about it. And then you see a few stories in Matthew 11 and 12 with how Jesus handled it. So not only does he tell us how to go out and preach the gospel and deal with the responses, but he actually models it in these very chapters, which is pretty neat. So I don't know, what else should we say to kind of set up the reading for today?
No, I think that's good. I'd say another thing that's happening here in chapter 11 is the confusion that kind of accompanied the coming of the kingdom, and how people had their thoughts about what it might have been like, and how there was questions about it, and then how would somebody understand it better.
Mm-hmm.
um, we have the same problems now, even when we try to present the gospel, is people have their ideas about what it means to be a Christian, or what it means to belong to God. And we see some of that confusion, I think, being dealt with here. So
Cool. So everybody will kind of notice verse 1 says when Jesus had finished giving instructions. It's kind of one of those markers in Matthew, like the quote unquote sermon maybe is done. So there's going to be a little the stuff we'll look at starting today in chapter 11, maybe a little bit more, I don't know, bite-sized teachings rather than one kind of long chunk like we had in the Sermon on the Mount or here in Matthew 10. But it's really good stuff. So why don't we go and get into it? We'll read verses 1 to 19 and then talk about it. When Jesus had finished giving instructions to his 12 disciples, he departed from there to teach and preach in their cities. Now, when John, while imprisoned, heard of the works of Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, and the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who does not take offense at me." As these men were going away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Those who wear soft clothing are in king's palaces. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and one who is more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, 'Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you.' Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has not arisen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and violent men take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to accept it, John himself is Elijah who was to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. But to what shall I compare this generation? It's like children sitting in the marketplaces who call out to the other children and say, 'Played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a gluttonous man and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds.
All right. There's a lot of interesting stuff, I think, going on here in the Gospel of Matthew regarding John the Baptist and Jesus. Almost in some ways a contrast. And that's what you just read there in verses 16 through 19. Jesus is going to say, like, hey, the way this generation has accepted John and me says a lot about that generation and the people that they came to. I think there's a lot for us to unpack with that. But John the Baptist and Jesus' relationship, Matthew has a little bit to say about that in the gospel. First time we really, excuse me, read about sort of this thing about John being in prison or John being in custody was back in chapter 4, verse 12. And back there, it said that when Jesus knew that John had been taken into custody, he went into Galilee and he kind of withdrew to those cities and was preaching there. So it sounds like when we get here, John the Baptist has been in custody for some amount of time and sends some messengers to ask Jesus some questions. Matthew will tell us when we get to chapter 14 why John was in prison and what had caused all of that to happen. But one of the things to take away from this section has something to do with the way Jesus and John were being received as preachers with the people they were coming to, kind of like you pointed out in the intro. Any thoughts about that right now?
Well, I mean, ultimately, the way they were both received was they were both rejected because they were doing what God wanted them to do.
And misunderstood.
Right.
Completely misunderstood. And then sort of pegged for, hey, this is really what these people are like based upon, some superficial measurements of things.
Yeah. And that's a good lesson, a good reminder. And I have a hard time remembering that sometimes, but we've talked about that a number of times, just even recently, how you kind of evaluate those things when you're trying to do what's right. You're probably going to have people either misunderstand your intentions or your character. And you're probably going to have people reject you and even like deride you. I mean, they said bad things, demon possessed, just a licentious person. Like that was the extremes that they gave to these guys for totally different reasons. But it's a good just reminder of, like we said, some of the things we saw back in chapter 10. Jesus said, if they called me, they said I was working for Beelzebul, what do you think they're going to say about you? This is just how it goes if you really try to do what God wants.
Yeah, good. So looking at verse 1 of chapter 11, maybe that's one observation. Jesus just sent these guys out, but he's not sending them out asking them to do something different than he's doing.
Yeah.
Like as soon as they go, he goes back to preaching and teaching in their cities. So he's facing the same things. We need to remember that. Like, I don't know. I think sometimes Christians get this idea that it was like, well, Jesus is up there doing his thing. We're the ones down here having to do the work. Yeah, but he was willing to do the work first. And I don't know if you've ever had a boss that maybe wasn't willing to do the work that he was asking you to do, but when you have somebody who's willing to do it alongside of you, that's really helpful. But yeah, Jesus goes and starts preaching and teaching in those places.
Yeah. And that's a theme. I mean, the book of Acts hits on that quite a bit, that there's all these little stories that Jesus is this constant force and this actor all throughout the book, even though he's not on earth. But the book of Acts begins by saying, hey, and the last thing I told you in the book of Luke about all that Jesus began to do and teach. And then there's these moments where Jesus will pop up and actually remind some of the disciples, mostly the apostles, but different disciples even, hey, I'm with you, or hey, I'm doing this. And it's just a really good reminder for us that I don't believe that's changed, that he's still working, and we're just working alongside of him.
Yeah. Charity just made a comment about how Jesus is still often very misunderstood. And sometimes maybe even by us who claim to be followers of his. I think there's a real important hint given in this text about how do we avoid misunderstanding Jesus? We'll talk about here in a minute. Was John confused? Was John misunderstanding? Was John, because of his trials and his circumstances, doubting? I think those are good questions, which we can address here in a second. But I want to focus on right now, how does Jesus answer the question? So the question in verse 2 or verse 3, are you the expected one or do we look for somebody else? Jesus says in verse 4, go report to John what you hear and see.
Yeah.
He doesn't tell them the answer, he shows them and lets them sort of listen in, and then says, just go tell John what you heard and what you saw, report that to him. And the implication is John is going to be able to figure out the answer to his question based on what he hears and what he sees. And as they're going away, as they're leaving and departing, in verse 7, I have this underlined in my Bible. Jesus asked a couple questions. What did you go out to the wilderness to see? What did you see? Verse 8. What did you see? Verse 9. What did you see? What Jesus is doing with them is he's saying, be people who make good observations. You know, the prophecy of Isaiah that said Jesus was going to come to people whose eyes wouldn't see, whose ears wouldn't hear, their hearts would be hard, because the faculties God gave them to be able to see and hear things and make and understand, those were broken. Those weren't working properly. So this whole text is redirecting to, if you don't want to misunderstand, or if you don't want people to misunderstand, then make sure that what you say and what you show is clearly seen, and direct people's attention to that. I think those are all great questions in this text that Jesus keeps asking.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just to drill down, I love in Luke's account, he includes a little detail that Matthew doesn't, that the people asked the question, and it said at that very moment in Luke 7:21, at that very moment, Jesus performed many miracles.
Right.
And then he answered them, and he said the exact thing that's recorded here in Matthew. I love that Jesus, he asked the question, and I just imagine Jesus kind of looking at him and just kind of walking off.
Right.
And then kind of be like, wait, dude, and then he does all this stuff, and then he comes back and says, exactly what you said, go and all the stuff you've seen, and by the way, all the people that walked away, the stuff you heard them saying about me, go tell. I also think on a practical level for us, so for me, when I'm struggling with my faith in Jesus, when I'm struggling with my understanding of the gospel, one of the most important places for me to go is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that's because that's me seeing and hearing, right, at least secondhand, but these accounts of what Jesus did and what Jesus said. Because all the noise, because people can get frustrated, and sometimes it's warranted, sometimes it's unwarranted, but regardless, whatever it happens, we'll get frustrated with church, or we'll get frustrated with ourselves, or we'll just run into this temptation that makes us doubt, wait, do I have to resist this? Is it okay? All the world sends us all these messages. I need to come back to, what did Jesus say and what did Jesus do? And that, because that's the basis of our faith. The basis of our faith is this person, Jesus, and who he is and what he did and what he said. And what that also means is, to me, I mean, so often people are like, I don't know, I just can't get into Christianity. And I'll just ask them, not in a confrontational way necessarily, but just like, well, have you ever read the biographies of Jesus's life? Not they're exactly biographies, but pretty close. And they'll be like, oh, no, I never have. Like, I knew some church people, or I went to some church or Catholic school growing up or whatever. And I'll be like, okay, well, you should check it out. And if you want to, like, I'd be happy to read it with you, just a no pressure thing. Like, you can learn about it, and then you actually know what you're rejecting. Because right now, you're rejecting a caricature of Jesus that you kind of imagine is real. But actually, you need to go back and get the real story, and then figure out if you're going to reject him or not, And so I think that's a good practice for us when we're trying to persuade people to believe in Jesus. There's a lot of things that I think are good to teach, and people have a lot of different methods for bringing people to faith. But one of the most important ones at some point early on in someone's journey with the Lord is to help them just read one of the Gospels, to see Jesus for real.
Yeah, very good. I would add to that, one of the most powerful things God's ever done in his word is he told us really specific things about the life of Jesus hundreds of years before Jesus. Some of the most graphic stuff about Jesus' crucifixion isn't even in the New Testament. It's in the Old Testament. Like Isaiah 53. And you remember how Isaiah 53 starts. Lord, who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Like, who has seen and heard the right things? You notice in this text that we just read, Jesus keeps referring to the prophets. I
Yeah.
mean, down there in verse 13, he says, for until John, for all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you're willing to accept it, and this is the issue, isn't it? And then in verse 15, he's going to say, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Now, he does the same thing with John's disciples. When they show up and say, hey, are you the expected one? Jesus doesn't just give them a simple, yes, look at this.
I do cool stuff. Check it out.
I do cool stuff. He points out, and that's really what verse 5 is. The prophet said this is what he was going to be doing. So, to your point, not only do I go and read the accounts of Jesus when my faith is struggling, one of the things that always convicts me and brings me back is I go read the accounts in the Old Testament.
Sure.
How did they know? How could they explain it? I don't know if you've ever done this with somebody that didn't know the Bible, but if you have them read Isaiah 53 and say, hey, who's that talking about? Even if they're not believers, they'll say, oh, that's talking about Jesus. They know it's talking about Jesus. And then you can ask them, so when was that written? And they'll be like, I don't know. And say, well, think about it. When do you think that would have had to have been written if it's about Jesus? And they'll always say, well, I guess like what, around the time of Jesus or after? And when you point out that it was written hundreds of years before, it kind of blows their mind.
Yeah.
So what's the point? Open your eyes to this. Open your ears to this. Like, accept the way that God has been telling the story throughout human history so that you can clearly see who the Messiah really is. Who is Jesus?
Yeah.
I
Well, those
think
prophecies.
go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead. Sorry.
I was just saying, I think this text keeps tying all that back together.
Mhm. No doubt. Well, just one more kind of. It was a strange. It's the only time, maybe one other time, and I think it's the only time it's ever happened to me. I think I may have mentioned this before. We had a Bible study with a lady who was from the Far East, and she had never read the Bible. Totally no background in Christianity. And to your point about Isaiah 53, she didn't know at all. We read Isaiah 53 and told her about this person and just kind of left the text with what it was. And she just started like getting emotional. She's like, who is this? This is an amazing. She fell in love with Jesus before she even knew his name,
Right.
because she read that prophecy. So just to support your point that whether it's me as somebody who believes, and I need to be strengthened with the prophets, or somebody who maybe knows a little bit about Jesus, to use the prophets especially Isaiah, as a sort of evidence for Jesus, or even with someone who doesn't know that much, there's a lot of power in those, and Jesus highlights them here.
Yeah. I think there's another important thing going on here that I need to hear. We're so used to being lazy, I think. I just want to know the answers to things. Like lately when I'm going and looking at news articles, I just want like the gist of it. I don't really want to read all the data and all the research. I just want somebody to tell me what it is. I guess I'm more and more skeptical of things like that as time goes on, and then think if I really want to know the answer to something, I kind of have to do the research here. But one of the things that the Bible teaches pretty clearly is it's a foolish thing to believe something where there's no evidence for it.
Mm-hmm.
Just because claims are made doesn't really mean anything. I think we know that deep down. How many people in our lives have told us with their mouth that they love us, but they don't really demonstrate it? God's always been like that. I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but in the Old Testament, you can barely find a place in the Old Testament where God actually says, I love you to the Jews. There's a place where Moses said, God's loved us, but God himself saying, I love you, that doesn't happen until almost the end of the Old Testament. But did God love them? Yeah. And what God had done is shown them that. He'd shown them that. Just like here, hey, Jesus, are you the expected one? He's not just going to say, well, yeah. He's going to show people the evidence so that they can make a conclusion. Now, here's why this is important. When we doubt God or doubt God's love or doubt God's faithfulness, part of what we're, I think, hoping for is some huge sign to fall out of heaven or some like moment where we're convinced. No, think it through, go back through, like pay attention to what it is that God's done in your life and how God's been faithful to you, and then conclude whether or not God's faithful or God's loving. Don't be lazy with it. Now, the flip side of that is we just studied the Sermon on the Mount. That's the same way God measures our love and faith. We don't get to just say, I have faith. James says, show me your faith.
Mhm.
We don't get to just say, I have wisdom. James 3 says, show me your wisdom. Same thing with love. You don't just get to say love with word or with tongue, but in deed and in truth. So the way God communicates himself to us is through deeds and action. The way we communicate ourselves to God is through deeds and action. So
Yeah. Yeah, and that gives a greater like the more evidence there is, the more reliable our conclusions can be about anything. Like I actually know this isn't just a guess, this isn't a wish that this is correct, but I have a lot of evidence. So there's a greater degree of reliability and security about those beliefs. The other thing that's interesting to me though about this is there is a with whether it was John personally who was asking these questions or if it was John wanted to kind of pass the torch on with his disciples really believing in Jesus. I don't really have a strong opinion on that. I'm not sure. I can see it both ways. And there may be even a door number 3 there, but I don't know exactly why John asked this question, if it was personal doubt or other people's doubts or whatever that he wanted to highlight. But it did do that. Like Jesus said, well, hey, look, this is a reliable belief to understand that I am the expected one. But Jesus also in the next section where he talks about how they viewed John, which really was just a gateway to challenge them and how they viewed him.
right.
He also says, like, look at the evidence because there's a greater degree of accountability to your response. This isn't like, it's not like we're going to get there on Judgment Day and guys be like, you know what, it was kind of just, who knows with all this stuff. There wasn't much evidence for you guys to go on. So, if you didn't ever believe or you didn't ever really submit to Christ, then it's okay. It's no problem. Part of the one thing God says, there's a lot of evidence here. There was creation, there was the prophets, there was Jesus himself, there's all this kind of stuff. So there's a greater degree of accountability. And Jesus even calls them out on that. What did you go out to see? And he challenges them, like, you saw something and you know what you saw, and it wasn't some things and it was other stuff, and your response to that really matters. So I think that's that issue of evidence is partly to secure us, but it's also to challenge us to really step up to the plate and embrace the reality of things.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Let's talk a little bit about that thing you said. Like, why is John asking this question? I think the two reasonable options are he is personally doubting because of his circumstance. Karen Whitman or Whiteman, I don't know how to pronounce that, I guess. She was pointing out, like, they had this sort of physical kingdom idea about what the Messiah was going to come to do, and they were misunderstanding what his kingdom was going to be like. So could John be wrestling with some of that, and so he needs to hear the answer? Or like you said, it was more for the sake of the disciples of John to say, guys, stop paying attention to me, pay attention to Jesus, go watch what he does. I'll tell you, my personal opinion is it reads to me like John has the question. It reads to me not like John just wanted to convince his disciples, but that he really had the question. He sent word by his disciples, and Jesus says, go tell John. This isn't just about them, it's something about John. So what do we learn from that? Expectations that we have in our life can really mess with us. Expectations and the way we imagine life should be, or the way the Jews imagined the kingdom should be, can really mess you up. It's like idolatry. We build these images in our head, and then when they don't come to fruition, we think, well, God's been unfaithful, or why, like, God must not be telling me the truth. And the fact of the matter is, God didn't say any of those things. Those are my imaginations and my expectations. So here's what I'm curious about with John. I don't know that John would have been somebody who thought in terms of earthly kingdom stuff. He lived in a wilderness. He wasn't born like in a way and living in a way that would have given him an indication that the kingdom was going to be physical. But I do think John was human. And when our lives don't begin to match up with what we hope they would, that's when we have questions.
Mm-hmm.
John's in prison now. he got to be like one of the greatest spokesmen for God in the history of the world. Jesus would even say that. Nobody's greater than John. Wonder if John had these moments in his life where he's like, man, I'm so privileged to have this job, to be given this ministry. What am I doing in prison? Why does it look like I'm not going to get out? Like, this is not what I thought my life would be like. I miss the exciting days of when I was baptizing everybody and when I got to preach, when everybody was coming out to me. And after a while, the question becomes, is this for real? Is this really what God intended? Um, those are the times when in my life I've struggled the most, is when my personal expectations for the way my life should be don't look the way they should in my mind.
And um, that's such an important lesson coming right off the heels of the commission Jesus gave to his disciples. Go out, preach. Here's how people are going to respond to you. Even John, the great revered John, that everybody was going out of Jerusalem to see out in the wilderness and being baptized, all that kind of stuff. Things didn't go the way he expected. Now, how much worse? And look at me, if it's not already, it's already happening. It's going to happen even more, and it's going to happen to you too. I heard somebody say one time, let's see, what's the quote? Expectations are premeditated resentment. And their point was that, and I think it was specifically like in relation like to people that are newly married. You just imagine like it's gonna be perfect and amazing, and then it's like a real life. This person has real issues just like you do, and it's not like you magically become perfect people when you get married. But that applies to so many things in life, I think, and especially when it comes to serving God. Maybe it may be a little bit more positive to say expectations can be premeditated resentments. They're not always. Sometimes expectations are as good as we would hope. But a lot of times it's true. Like I think, oh, I'm going to go preach the gospel to this person, or I'm going to go do this act of service, or I'm going to resist this temptation, or I'm going to be holy at work, or and it's going to be great. And it's going to be like this big, there's the music's going to play and the sun's going to shine, and it doesn't. And it wasn't for John, and it wouldn't for Jesus, and it won't for us if we follow God. But the promise of Jesus is that if we'll, verse 11, truly I say to you, among those born of women, there's not arisen anyone greater than John the Baptist, yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven. If you'll just stick with it, if you'll keep on serving God, if you'll keep following Jesus, that person will be greater than the one who is greater than all those who were born of women. That's pretty good. Like there's a reward in this service.
Yeah, no, that's super amazing. Yeah, I like that quote that you gave. I've never heard that before, but that makes perfect sense. I mean, just think about relationships in general, not just marriages, but people's relationship with God, friendships. How many times have you like felt like somebody wasn't being a very good friend to you? But then when you really stop and think about it, you thought, I just sort of imagined the way they were going to be my friend. They never made me certain promises.
Yeah.
Like, I think the more we can just operate between us and God and us and people based upon what people have actually said, not what we hope for, but what they've actually promised or said, we would just be a lot healthier, I think, in our minds and in our relationships and dealing with the future that's uncertain.
Yeah.
I think that's really helpful.
No doubt. I don't know, man. It's 11:59. What else?
Well, I'm just trying to avoid verse 12 because I have no idea what it means. So
okay, sounds good.
Maybe next time when we come back, we can talk about what verse 12 might mean. There's a little bit more for us to say about this section, but we can move on to the second half of the chapter next time. I sure appreciate everybody being with us, and we missed you guys over the last couple of weeks. I've missed doing this, so we'll find our groove again and get back to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll pick up right here on. Are you good Wednesday?
So I was just about to say, I'm traveling. I'm not sure what we're doing Wednesday. So if ever could, I guess just watch online and see what we say about with the little announcements. I need to figure that out. I got in at 4:00 this morning here, and I haven't really asked what we're doing the next couple of days, so I'm not sure yet.
Yeah. All right. Cool. All right. Thanks for the good comments, everybody. We love you all. Take care.